Good morning. Welcome to George Mason University and Antonin Scalia Law School. My name is Henry Butler. I'm the Dean of Scalia Law. It's a real pleasure to have you here today for this conference on competition and consumer protection in the 21st century. George Mason and Antonin Scalia Law School is a particularly appropriate place to be teaming up with the FTC. We have a long and glorious history of antitrust scholars, consumer protection scholars on our faculty, going back to my first day on the faculty in June of 1986, where Bill Kovacic and I started the same day. We added Tim Uris, Bob Bork, Doug Ginsburg, on and on, Ernie Gellhorn, an incredible group of people over the years. Today we have an incredibly strong group of economists. We have 11 PhD economists on our faculty, as well as several folks with PhDs in finance and accounting. So a very strong business-oriented place. But in addition to that, a great connection with the FTC over the years. Of course, Josh Wright is on our faculty, Tim Uris, I mentioned earlier. Incredible group there, but currently we have Bruce Kobayashi is the head of the Bureau of Economics. James Cooper is over at the Bureau of Consumer Protection working on privacy issues. Bilal is here somewhere. Bilal is one of our mainstays on the adjunct staple and an alum of the school. So it's a long list of connections with the FTC, and it's really great to welcome all of you here for this in-depth probing of the relationship between competition and consumer protection as our economy evolves. So it's with great pleasure that I now turn things over to Commissioner Chopra. Have a great 3 days. I look forward to meeting you.
So thank you all for being here, and I also want to thank our host and all the staff and others who put all of this together. It is a lot of work, and I hope it will pay off big. Last month, the Federal Trade Commission hearings focused on the state of play of competitiveness of the U.S. economy and the application of antitrust law. In this and future hearings, we will focus specifically on platforms and digital marketplaces and the implications of big data, algorithms, and artificial intelligence. As we turn our focus to digital marketplace concerns, I think we should approach this inquiry with three major questions in mind. First, what are digital marketplaces and how do they compare to other marketplaces? Second, what are the role and implications of mass data surveillance in these marketplaces? And third, how do privately established rules and regulations promote or distort the competitive process on these marketplaces? Now, in my view, the FTC's core role, and government more broadly, is to make sure that our markets are working, free of anti-competitive lies and distortions. This role protects two key groups, both buyers and honest sellers. And safeguarding the competitive process is a prerequisite for prosperity. Government has long sought to create laws and regulations that structure and facilitate marketplaces that work. Laws that safeguard an individual's ability to contract and possess property are foundational to functioning markets. This is recognized not only here at home, it's also universal. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights declares that, quote, no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his property. Now, these foundational laws are supplemented by others that promote free and fair markets. In our country's own history, many cities and towns established public marketplaces for butchers, bakers, farmers, and fishers to sell their products. By bringing together all buyers and sellers in one place, buyers would be able to easily compare products and prices, and sellers could count on a steady stream of customers. Local government could more easily enforce standards for health and safety, weights and measures, and other protections. Buyers would know that their food wasn't spoiled and the scales weren't rigged, protecting the competitive process. Now, in today's economy, digital marketplace platforms carry the potential to facilitate ideas and commerce by bringing together market participants, leveraging the market power of network effects. This is exactly what the internet promised: a dynamic market with low barriers to entry and a level playing field. Digital marketplaces connect buyers and sellers of goods and services. Like the farmers and fishers at the public market, sellers offer their goods and buyers can compare and purchase. Just as cities and towns would facilitate craft markets or spice markets, these digital marketplaces can focus on specific goods and services like books or hotel rooms. Other marketplaces include sellers of all types, including creators of content, news, and works of art, including photography and video. These marketplaces also enforce their own rules and regulations for sellers and creators. Some digital marketplaces focus on individually provided services. Other marketplaces help to facilitate the reduction of economic spoilage by connecting, say, drivers and riders going in the same direction, or households with an extra bedroom or couch with travelers. This has been described as, quote, the sharing economy, though they have since developed into major marketplaces connecting buyers and sellers of fissured labor. These marketplaces also develop and enforce rules and regulations, including ones that set prices and assess trust and character. Now, of course, there are many differences between public marketplaces with butchers and bakers and today's digital marketplaces. The first key distinction relates to data. Now, unlike the family who shopped at the fish market or who tuned into a television program a generation ago, participation in a digital marketplace is not always an anonymous experience where you can browse for free. Marketplaces are monitoring individuals, families, and businesses, harvesting data in ways that we might not recognize or even understand. This goes far beyond what buyers are looking at and can include where they were when they looked at offerings or content, who they were with, and more. For sellers, data about the prices they charge, the way they deliver goods and services, and many other attributes are ingested. Now, this surveillance can include collection of data completely unrelated to what is needed to participate in the marketplace. Devices and appliances in our homes collect sensory data about our daily activities, but how much of this collection is for the functioning of the device, and how much is it purely for monetization or sale? Marketplace operators develop software and algorithms to analyze this data at scale to make inferences about individuals and groups. Machine learning, including Bayesian network and deep learning, aid in the development of artificial intelligence, which helps to mimic the human brain and fully understand the habits, biases, and motivations for buyers and users on a marketplace. The Internet of Things, or IoT, helps to collect even more sensory data from our daily user activities, making artificial intelligence and predictive analytics sharper and more powerful. Now, this cycle of learning offers significant gains to some, but harvesting data is not like mining gold. Those who were the first to collect at scale may have a major advantage. This aggregation and analysis of data has huge value, and the information asymmetry that may be implicated by this raises a number of questions about the competitive landscape. Marketplace operators can monetize the data that has been surveilled in many different ways. The most basic way is targeted ads. A more advanced way is for the marketplace operator to have a financial stake in a seller's offering or to directly compete with sellers of the same product or service. One scholar, Shoshana Zuboff, has described this economic model as, quote, surveillance capitalism. The inferences drawn from the analysis of mass data collection can be stunningly effective. Many of us have surely been in a situation where you have a private conversation about something and later see an ad delivered to you for that product, and many wonder whether their phone is spying on them. But even if your conversations aren't being recorded and analyzed, the analysis of other data collected on us can be just as predictive of what is truly on your mind or even what you have just said. These inferences can even be used to inform individualized pricing. Here is where our existing model of thinking about markets truly breaks down. Whether selling a basket of bread or a basket of bonds, a buyer now needs to think if they are being charged a higher price compared to someone else browsing for that same product. If information is critical to dominate markets and Congress has tasked the FTC to safeguard those markets from unfair methods of competition, we must be sure we understand how marketplaces work, including their structure, their data collection methods, and their business arrangements. And I think several lines of inquiry demand further study, including collection practices. How do marketplace operators collect, store, and secure data? To what extent are participants aware of the extent of what data is being collected? How do operators assemble data on non-participants through the use of, quote, shadow profiles or similar inventories? How frequently do operators mark content to match it to specific devices, as in fingerprinting, for the purposes of data aggregation? Property rights. When a content creator uses a platform to distribute their work, who truly owns this content? When sellers distribute their product or services through a marketplace, who owns data about the transaction? Who has the right to sell or share this data? And perhaps more simply, who owns your online identity? Predictive analytics. What is the range of data that feeds algorithms? What third-party data are combined with other data to draw inferences about marketplace participants? What is the role of machine learning? How do operators safeguard against bias against protected classes under housing, employment, and credit discrimination laws? Monetization. In what ways do operators create economic value from the analysis of data? In what ways can this data be used to engage in exclusionary conduct? How is the data used to develop personalized pricing, and what are the implications of this for competition? The second distinction relates to the regulations or rules imposed by the marketplace operator. Public marketplaces in the United States were typically operated by cities and towns, so regulations were subject to the democratic process, with theoretically the competitive process and the public interest in mind. For example, with bread, there might have been a standardized size for a loaf to help buyers compare and sellers compete. Regulations might have governed the allocation of stalls and safety inspection requirements for meat and produce. Pricing for stalls may have covered the costs of operating the marketplace, with subsidies or surpluses coming from or going to the town treasury or to improve the marketplace. Regulations might have also sought to ensure the market maintained popularity and reaped the economic benefits and the virtuous cycle of network effects. Digital marketplaces, of course, are not operated by the public, so the regulations are developed by their owners, usually governed through terms of service. Like the public marketplaces, today's digital marketplace regulations might seek to standardize certain procedures to promote scale and comparison shopping, while also taking steps to ensure that sellers are honest. However, a key difference is that some regulations and rules might seek to serve the private interest of the marketplace operator. For example, their regulations might preference the goods and services on offer where the operator competes with other sellers. Their regulations might also forbid marketplace sellers from offering their goods at a lower price on another marketplace, or require sellers to pay more for premier placement. While some of these private regulations might protect the competitive process, are some of these regulations driven by the profit motive of the marketplace operator in ways that conflict with the competitive process? These are many of the questions we must answer. Additional questions about regulations and restraints include contracting. What role do marketplace operators play in the contracting process between buyers and sellers? Who are the parties? Preferencing. How do marketplace operators show preferential treatment to some sellers over others? What factors do they consider, and what are the implications of this? Maintenance. What steps do operators take that have the effect of deterring the formation of new competing marketplaces? In today's economy, is it even possible to avoid some of these marketplaces? Price controls. In what ways do digital marketplace operators engage in setting or regulating prices for sellers on the market? Now, as my colleague, Commissioner Rebecca Kelly Slaughter, outlined in her remarks before one of last month's hearings, the distinction between consumer protection and competition is becoming blurry when it comes to facets of today's digital economy. I agree with her that it would be a mistake to categorize the questions before us simply using these two labels. We must approach this holistically with the goal of making markets work well for all participants, buyers, sellers, users, and creators. This will require more than just discussion. The FTC derives expertise and learnings from enforcement, but we also must engage in analytically rigorous examination of data surveillance and monetization techniques, as well as an analytically rigorous assessment of the regulations and restraints imposed by today's digital marketplaces. Without this information about how our digital economy is governed by some of the largest companies and operators, we won't know if markets are working or if they may be breaking down. So I look forward to these next set of hearings to serve as a starting point to deepen our understanding of digital marketplaces and platforms. These marketplaces may not operate like they did in history or how we learned about them in economics textbooks. And if we do not understand them, we are in big trouble. Shedding light on how marketplaces and platforms engage in data collection and analysis, as well as how their rules and regulations promote or impede the competitive process, will be a great contribution to advancing the Federal Trade Commission's mission and developing policy that will make sure our markets are truly working. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Chopra, for that wonderful introductory speech. We have two opening presentations to follow. The first is going to be by David Evans, and he's going to speak about the economics of multi-sided platforms. David is the chairman of the Global Economics Group at the firm's Boston office. Following David will be a presentation by Catherine Tucker, and she's going to speak about network effects in multi-sided platforms. Catherine is the Sloan Distinguished Professor of Management Science and Professor of Marketing at the Sloan School at MIT. David?
So thank you, Commissioner Chopra, for that nice set of remarks. It was a really good opening act for me. So what I was asked to do today, and thank you all very much for asking me to come to this. I guess I need to speak in front of this microphone here. Is that the deal? I can't move around, so I need to stay here. Okay. So I was asked to give a very basic introduction to multi-sided platforms, so that's what I'm going to do for the next 30 minutes. So let me start out with BlaBlaCar. So if you happen to be stuck in Paris and you want to take a nice trip to Barcelona, you could use BlaBlaCar to do that. It's a ride-sharing company, and they match up drivers and passengers, and they try to do that in a way so that it's a pleasant trip. That's a 10-hour drive from Paris to Barcelona, so you kind of want to be in the car with people you like. In order to get you matched up, they need to have a nice density of drivers and passengers between those city pairs, so they kind of need that in order to make the thing work. They have an interesting pricing model, so you can't be a professional driver, really, for BlaBlaCar. What they do is they cap the fee for the driver at basically the cost of gas plus a little bit of depreciation. I was in Australia for all of last week, so I've had to switch back from saying petrol to gas. And then finally, one of the nice things about this is it increases both driver and passenger welfare. And we know that because we see those smiling faces right in the middle of the screen there. So that's an example of a platform. And there's an increasing number of these, as we know, just sort of in our daily lives. From the minute we wake up in the morning until the time we go to bed, whether it's in our personal lives or whether it's in our work lives, we're interacting with these kinds of platform businesses all the time. One of the reasons I suspect we're here is that there are a number of very prominent multi-sided platforms around the world. If you take a look at the 10 largest companies in the world, publicly traded companies in the world by market cap, 7 of them derive a significant portion of their revenue from operating one or more platforms. On the right-hand side, there are examples of some of the platforms that they operate. So these are very common part of the economy in our lives these days. It's not a new business model, as Commissioner Chopra mentioned. It goes back millennia. There are these kind of businesses all over the place. What is new is starting around 2000, economists developed an interesting economic literature that studies these kind of businesses and offers a variety of insights. Listed there are some of the foundational theoretical papers, and we'll obviously be discussing much more of that today. So what I want to do first is to do a deep dive into how these businesses operate, elaborating on some of the remarks that you've already heard. So these platforms tend to emerge when there's an opportunity to solve a friction between partners. I have a tendency to call them trading partners. That may not be all that intuitive, but it's basically when there are a couple of economic agents for which there's a value increasing opportunity for an exchange or other kind of interaction. So here are a bunch of examples of situations where frictions are reduced. So we just went through one where you have drivers with spare capacity in their cars and passengers looking for a ride. You have the situation where marketers would like to pay to deliver a message to me, an advertisement to me, and they're willing to pay more than I'm willing to pay to avoid it. So there's an opportunity for an exchange there and possibly some frictions in between. Men and women or other opposites would like to get together for romance, frictions possibly in that market. Buyers and sellers would like to get together in order to buy and sell things, but they need a common method of payment and need to agree on what that is, and there's a value to agreeing on something that's common. Now, what platforms do is they reduce transactions costs and they internalize externalities for those kinds of situations. So they do that in a couple of ways. First of all, they bring these parties together onto a common platform, and that solves, in effect, a collective action problem. And then once they've gathered these groups of different kinds of people or businesses or generally economic agents, they have ways to get them together in order for them to find good matches. So they reduce transactions costs by having matching mechanisms and other things that are basically designed to make the interaction possible, to make the exchange possible, and for it to be consummated. Now, there are a bunch of externalities that we ought to think about for these kinds of businesses, and I think Commissioner Chopra actually gave a good rendition of pretty much all of them, but let me elaborate a little bit more using economic language. So we have positive indirect network externalities. So that's the very basic thing that we always focus on when we talk about multi-sided platforms. Drivers value the platform more if they can get access to more passengers, because that makes it more likely they'll be able to fill up their car. Passengers like a platform more if they can get access to more drivers, because it's more likely that they'll be able to find a driver who they like, who's driving to the destination that they want to go in. So we have that classic positive indirect network externality. And as you saw in the case of BlaBlaCar, you need to have a density of drivers and passengers who who are right for each other in a sense. I think Catherine is going to talk more about that in detail. There are also negative externalities. So, for example, in the case of the car sharing platform, I really don't want strangers sitting in my car. So there's a negative externality from that. So we need to deal with that. Ad load on advertising media-supported sites is an example of a arguable negative externality. There's congestion on these platforms that needs to be dealt with. And then finally, and I particularly like the fact that Commissioner Chopra emphasized this, there are behavioral externalities on these platforms. Whenever you put together a community of people, just people, whenever you put together a community of people and businesses, they can do bad stuff to each other. And we'll see in a minute that one of the consequences of that is, in fact, rules and regulations. But there's the traditional problems that we always have in trade, so there can be fraud and deception and that standard list of problems. There's the gross stuff that can happen on platforms. And then there's the really bad stuff, including verbal and physical violence that takes place. Those are all things that we have whenever we have a community, and they potentially need to be dealt with on platforms. Managing those kinds of externalities and the full gamut of them, from indirect network externalities to negative externalities to behavioral externalities, those are really central to what platforms do and distinguish them from traditional businesses. So one way platforms address these kinds of externalities is through pricing and other aspects of the terms of trade. So like Catherine, I'm from Boston. I don't know why I have all these European examples, but I happen to be working on something in Germany, so I have Der Spiegel instead of Vogue. But it's basically the same story for any ad-supported magazine. Der Spiegel uses pricing to determine in effect, determine how many readers they can offer the advertising side of the platform, also use the ad load to kind of balance that terms of trade between the advertisers and the readers. And then they use platforms generally use non-pecuniary methods. In the case of Der Spiegel, this turns out to be the content. And the content in this particular case serves a couple of purposes. It serves the purpose of, in effect, paying the readers to come onto the magazine in order to get themselves exposed to the advertisements. But the other thing that it's doing is it's serving as a matching device. So I don't read German, but I will take the word of the Spiegel group, which says that the content in that magazine, for whatever reason, attracts male educated readers with high income, and of course German. So that's one thing that is done to address externalities. The other thing that's done to address externalities on multi-sided platforms is all aspects of how these platforms are designed, how they're physically designed, and the tools and techniques that are embedded in the platform. And just in a very simple sense, the next time you go to a shopping mall, try to think through the logic of why stores are located in particular places, why the particular stores are there, why the mall is designed in a particular way. Same thing when you go on to a search results page for Google or Bing or whatever. There's a logic to how that's designed, and it's designed in a way to deal with these kinds of externalities. And then finally, rules and governance. So one of the things that characterizes many, not all, but many multi-sided platforms is that there are behavioral rules for interactions. There are do's and don'ts of being on the platform. And that generally means that there are rules, there are detection mechanisms, and there's enforcement mechanisms. So here's an example for the App Store, for the iPhone. Not everyone can get an app populated in the App Store. there are rules for that. So you have to go through a vetting process to get into the App Store. And if you violate the rules, once you're in the App Store, Apple can not only decide not to let you into the App Store in the first place, but they can also kick you out of the App Store. And that's a whole set of rules and a whole set of people working for Apple that are working on enforcing exactly that kind of set of rules and regulations. So let's put all that together for BlaBlaCar. So BlaBlaCar needs to have enough passengers for the drivers and enough drivers for the passengers. But in the case of the drivers, it has to compensate the drivers in order to get the drivers to have strangers sitting in their car. It adopted that peculiar pricing mechanism that I mentioned. They could have a pricing mechanism that offers higher compensation in order to attract more drivers, but they decided that they didn't want to be a platform where there were professional drivers working on the platform, because that has other externalities for the community. So they adopted a mechanism where the drivers just get, in effect, gas money. The platform deals with negative externalities, in effect, works on making sure that there were good exchanges between the two sides through a variety of mechanisms. So the name BlaBlaCar comes from one of the ways they do that. So when you sign up for BlaBlaCar, you have to rate yourself as blah, 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 or blah, 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 which is an indicator of how chatty you like to be. Now, in my case, I like to have the shush option, which is not available on BlaBlaCar, which suggests that this is not a platform that is sufficiently differentiated for me. They also have ladies only, a great way for women to feel even safer, which is an option they developed particularly for women that were new to the platform, just to make it a safe experience. As a result of doing all those things and lots of other things, they've been successful at getting enough drivers and enough passengers between different city pairs in a number of countries in the world that they've entered. They're now in 22 countries, in most of the European countries. They've entered into India as well, not in the US for various reasons, not in a bunch of other countries, but very successful in where they've chosen to be. So those are some aspects of kind of the business reality of two-sided platforms. What I want to turn to now is to talk a little bit about the kind of the basic economics of these kinds of businesses. So platforms connect two groups with indirect network effects, and they do that to reduce transaction costs and to facilitate exchange. So the platform operates as an intermediary between two sides. It does that in order to facilitate good exchanges or good interactions, and to basically reduce transactions costs between those two groups. Typically, always, they have indirect network externalities. So to be a two-sided platform, it's always going to be the case that one side values having more of the other side. Doesn't have to be for both sides, but at least one side values having more of the other side. And what the platform does is it facilitates those groups getting together, and as a result of doing that, is able to release the value of exchange. So that can, depending upon how things are distributed, make both parties better off as a result of that. And then as a result of releasing the gains to trade, the platform gets to share in a portion of that, and that's how it gets compensated. What I just described leads to the interdependence of demand between the two sides of the platform. So the standard models, and by that I mean the three main ones that I mentioned in the earlier slide, the ones in the original Roche and Tirole papers that kind of really kicked this field off, the Mark Armstrong paper from 2006, and Glenn Weil's paper that synthesizes those published in 2010 in the American Economic Review. Those all basically have models where there is interdependent demand that is developed in different ways under different assumptions. What I've put out there is the basic equation in Mark Armstrong's model, and what you see there is you see a demand function, D1 and D2, and what you see as arguments of the demand function is the demand or the quantity of use by the other side of the platform. So that's the interdependence that's introduced in the Armstrong model, and as we'll see, that has some important implications. When you do profit maximization, given that interdependent demand, when you, the platform, does profit maximization, you have to determine the two prices, and in effect what that means is you have to determine the pricing level for each one, how high or low are the level of price is going to be, but also in effect you determine the relative amounts of those prices. So there's a notion of pricing level, but there's also a notion of pricing structure, because in order to cover the cost of the platform, you can make a decision on, do I want to recover more of the cost from this side, less of the cost from this side, or vice versa, and that's part of the calculus that goes into profit maximization. That all has significant implications for the economics of these businesses. It leads to a positive feedback loop between the two sides that relates both demand and the pricing decisions on both sides, and it has a bunch of other interesting implications as well. So we have different models, different theoretical models, but they lead to pretty much the same place as a general matter. And the interesting thing when you solve out those models is that it turns out that it can be, doesn't have to be, but it can be profit maximizing to set prices on one side that is less than marginal cost. And this is the whole notion that one side, in effect, is going to be a subsidy side, and the other side is going to be a money side. So that less than marginal cost could manifest itself in, it could be prices of zero, so in other words, it is free. It could be prices less than zero, in which case there could be rewards. So that's what's true in theory. What is interesting in this area, and what got people really excited back in the early 2000s, is that this isn't just a sort of a sport, you know, an unusual case like razor and blades that you can give your students. Rather, when you actually take a look at these businesses that were characterized as two-sided platforms, we discover that that pricing result is not just true in theory, but that it's true in practice. So that for a lot of platforms, it turns out that prices are less than marginal cost. That's generally true for newspapers, print magazines, and so forth. It's common, obviously, for free to be the model for these businesses. That's most online media, and it's not uncommon to have rewards. So if you use OpenTable, you get rewards for using restaurants, but you don't have to pay any fee. If you use credit cards, of course, you get rewards. So, you know, in the discussion so far, I've talked about two-sided platforms. Just to record this, platforms can have more than two sides. Facebook has several sides. Google has three sides. Google Search has three sides, and so forth. But we tend to talk about two sides just to make things a little bit simpler. So that's a key result of the economics of two-sided platform. But there's more. So one of the other implications of the theory of two-sided platforms is it turns out that critical mass and the chicken and egg problem turn out to be very important for these kinds of businesses. And generally, if you want to operate one of these platforms, in order to deliver value to one side, you have to have the other side on board. And in order to deliver value to that side, you have to have the other side on board. So in order to really generate value, you need to have enough of both sides and in the right proportion. And we saw that in the case of BlaBlaCar. They had a lot of difficulty in the early years to get the platform off the ground because there just weren't enough drivers and passengers on particular city pairs. It was only once they were able to kind of move the demand for both groups up that they really had enough to get the thing off the ground. And that turns out to be a big challenge for these kinds of businesses. There is often, but not always, a chicken and egg problem in the sense that the only way you can solve that problem is to kind of figure out a way of getting both of them on board at more or less the same time. But there's this process of getting both on board that can be difficult. Now, this notion of critical mass, I mean, that certainly isn't original to two-sided platforms. There's a lot of interesting work in the older literature on indirect network effects that deals with critical mass. What is new and different with two-sided platforms is a recognition that that critical mass problem and the pricing results that I just mentioned cover a wide and surprising class of businesses. So, I mean, the insight is, well, yes, this covers the Windows operating system, but oh, gee, surprisingly, it covers shopping malls as well as the local farmers market and so forth. I'm not going to say much about multi-homing. We should probably talk more about that in the session. I know there are going to be some questions on that. But one of the interesting things that turns out to be important in the theoretical literature for multi-sided platforms is the importance of whether consumers on either side tend to use one platform, so they standardize on one, or for whatever reason, they're able to use multiple platforms. So most of us multi-home on credit cards. We have several in our wallet. Most merchants take several credit cards. Things get a little bit complicated when we start thinking about what the consumer does at the store. And at that point in time, the consumer is sort of single homing because they're pulling one card out. But there are some interesting implications from the extent to which there's single homing and multi-homing. If there's just single homing, then the only way that I, on the other side of the platform, can get access to those customers is through your platform, because those customers are only single homing on your platform, and that has some competitive implications that tend to really depend upon the facts of the business and business reality. So particularly after Amex, there's this great interest in defining two-sided platforms very, very precisely. I'm not sure that's necessarily the best use of intellectual energy, but we can talk about that. But let me give you what I think are the key components of the definition that tend to be used in practice in the papers. So you have two distinct types of customers for whom a value-increasing interaction is possible. There are frictions, breakdown of the Coase theorem, that makes those interactions difficult to arrange. The platform facilitates connections between those two distinct kinds of customers. And then participation by members of at least one group, this is the indirect network effects flowing in at least one direction, exists, so that there's a gain to aggregating customers onto a single platform. I think in practice, for economists working on this area, it generally comes down to whether a business is connecting two different types of customers, and for which there are sufficiently strong indirect network effects. Let me give a couple of pointers in terms of the scope of two-sided platforms. So ad-supported media are two-sided platforms. Advertisers on one side, users on the other side. This is the second friction externality that I mentioned in one of the early slides. The modern literature on ad-supported media since about the mid-2000s treats ad-supported media as two-sided platforms. So the classic paper in that area is Anderson and Gipsavich. And there are tons of really great empirical papers that use the two-sided framework for ad-supported media. It turns out that it's particularly easy in ad-supported media to get data on both sides. So there are very interesting papers, including some very nice ones using structural models for newspapers and radio in particular. Another point to just kind of keep in mind is that the members of the two groups have to be different for the purpose of the transaction or the purpose of the interaction that the platform is facilitating, but they could be the same economic agents. So if you think about something like Venmo, which is a P2P money transfer platform, people use that platform, but for any particular transaction, there's a sender and there's a receiver of funds. So the important thing is that for the transaction, there are differences and the demands are different, but they can be the same people. I guess another good example of that is eBay. People can buy stuff on eBay. They can sell stuff on eBay for a particular transaction. They're one or the other. One of the early definitions proposed by Roche and Tirole, I think in the 2006 paper, is that a defining characteristic of a two-sided platform is that the pricing structure can be manipulated in such a way to increase output. I think actually that once there are indirect network effects, and excluding the possibility of arbitrage between the two sides, that's an implication of indirect network effects, so that we would expect that price output relationship to be an implication of being a two-sided platform rather than being a defining characteristic. And I mention that because this actually came up in Justice Breyer's dissent in American Express. Having said that, as a practical matter, if I'm looking at businesses and trying to figure out whether they're two-sided platforms, I would take a look at whether the price structure matters. I would also take a look at whether there is a critical mass and chicken and egg problem in starting the platform, because those are all kind of clues as to whether you have this kind of multi-sided sidedness. Okay, so two-sided platforms aren't just complements, and everything is in a two-sided platform. I've said it. So let me cover the first of those. So in terms of complements, and I mention this because this is an argument that one sometimes gets. So if we think about complements in general, usually complements are being sold to the same customer. For example, gasoline and tires, nuts and bolts, and so forth. While the two-sided platforms are generally serving two different kinds of customers, at least for the purpose of that interaction. Complements can be sold by different firms. So some firms sell gas, some firms sell tires, some firms do sell both. In the case of platforms, if you want to operate a platform and you want to internalize these externalities, you have to have both groups of customers on the same platform, and you need to be serving both of them at the same time. The theory doesn't say that every business is two-sided, and it doesn't even say that every intermediary is two-sided. So many traditional businesses don't connect two sides. That's also true for some intermediaries. And many traditional businesses lack significant indirect network effects. Then the final point to just be made there is the two-sided theory has predictions on business behavior that are really interesting, that apply to these firms that we think of as two-sided platforms, but don't apply to traditional firms. The final example there is what BlaBlaCar does. What does BlaBlaCar do? Well, it sells drivers access to passengers, and it sells passengers access to drivers, and basically it's selling both of them connections to each other. So multi-sided platforms aren't everything, but having said that, they are increasingly common. And they're increasingly common because we've had this incredible technological change, including the internet, but including lots of other stuff, that has made it much more easy to start a platform business, to not only start that business, but to scale that business on a global basis. One of the things I think is true for an awful lot of the multi-sided platforms that we see, including many of the successful ones, is they're replacing other multi-sided platforms that were operating in a more fragmented way using older technology. But these platforms are definitely increasingly common, which I suspect is why we're having these hearings and why there is so much interest in this topic basically around the world. So I'd like to conclude. I'm told that I can conclude by having an advertisement. So if you want to learn more, Matchmakers is now available in multiple formats and in multiple languages. I think the French win the award for the most boring title. I think the Koreans won the award for the nicest cover. But in any case, if you want to learn more about multi-sided platforms, take a look at my book with Dick Schmalensee, Matchmakers.
All right, I have the fortune of being untethered, I believe, from the podium, so I'm going to take full advantage of it. So I'm Catherine Tucker. I am a professor at the MIT Sloan School of Management, and my job today is, much like David, to provide some instruction about network effects and how they relate to platforms. And in particular, I am charged with two missions. The first is to go back to introductory economics and talk about what really is a network effect. But I'm going to try and do something a bit interesting and sort of say how it's evolved as industry has evolved too in terms of its definition. And then we're going to go and think, well, how big a problem really are these network effects in these new platform markets, which we've just had so ably described. All right, so what is a network effect? It is a phrase which simply describes the value that users obtain from interacting from other users on a platform. One little hint here. Sometimes you hear them called network externalities. Sometimes you hear them called network effects. I prefer the term network effect. Why? Well, a network externality implies that no one is really internalizing the fact this is going on. And if you think what platforms are all about, it's all about internalizing these properties. So I like the term network effects and think of it as simply describing the value we get when we interact with someone else in a marketplace, in a platform. Now, I'm going to take you through different types of network effects. And we're going to start off going back in history, perhaps to the 1970s, and some work that was done in telecommunications, and introduce a concept of a direct network effect, which I like to call a same-side network effect. Now, what is this? It's what happens in terms of how I value users on a piece of technology, on a platform, who I interact with in a way which means they're similar to me. So, for example, on something like Skype, it's communication technology. I'm looking largely to communicate to people who look a lot like me. We can also see how network effects operate on communication technologies like Skype. If I am the only person with Skype installed on my computer, I look pretty silly, right? It's not a piece of junk software. The only reason I would install Skype on my computer is in order to communicate with other people. Therefore, I'm going to care about how many other users are also having Skype installed, and that's where we get a network effect. All right, so then we move on to what I like to call cross-site network effects to emphasize the idea that there will be different folks' interaction. And what maybe 10 years ago we were calling indirect network effects. And we're going to start off there with the sort of classic operating system case of a network effect. So if you take something like Linux, if I am a developer on Linux, I really care about how many people have Linux installed because I only want to make programs that people are actually going to use them. And similarly, when I'm making the decision about whether to install Linux on my computer, I'm going to really care about how many developers are actually developing software for that platform. And so we see a cross-site network effect where really we've got two quite different groups of people who care about the presence of the other group. Now, of course, we're going to remember that kind of case in the 1990s, so let's now move on to what the commissioner so elegantly called marketplaces, which are an incredibly broad brush now of our digital economy. And in these kind of marketplaces, say in the case of eBay, we have network effects too, and why is that? Well, if I am a seller of laser pointers, then I really care about how many people might want to buy that laser pointer. And similarly, if I am wanting to buy that laser pointer, I'm not going to be on eBay unless I think there's a reasonable chance there are going to be people selling it. So again, we can see the work of network effects there. Similarly, if I'm thinking about a ride-sharing application and I am thinking about whether I'm going to install an app, I'm only going to install Uber if I think there are going to be riders out there. And similarly, if I'm a driver, drivers out there, and if I'm a driver, no point driving for Uber unless I'm going to be able to pick up a passenger. Now, in terms of definitions, we were told to do our best with definitions. And what I always think about a platform is that the big problem with them is that, in some sense, everything sort of wants to be a platform. And I experienced this. The material you're seeing today is actually coming from the class I teach on platforms at MIT. And the first time I taught it, I made the mistake of putting up a slide of the top 50 brands, trying to inspire my students and saying, look how many of them are platforms. Of course, I looked at it and I said, oh, but Coca-Cola, not a platform, I guess. McDonald's, not a platform. But look at that top line. Everything else is sort of like working towards being a platform. And at that point, I had someone stick up their hand in a huge, furious rage. And they said, how dare you say that Coca-Cola and McDonald's are not platforms? I consult for both those companies. If you said that to their management, they would just be so insulted. How dare you? And I sort of looked at him. He looked at me. And I tried to find out why on earth he thought that McDonald's or Coca-Cola could be platforms. He came up with some sort of random story about Coca-Cola awards in the bottle tops. I didn't find it convincing then. I don't find it convincing now. But the key thing to take from this is it's definitely hard because everyone's trying to be a platform, especially in business, and they like to sort of bring forward this platform terminology, which is something I always struggle with. What I think is more useful is thinking about when things really are platforms, rather than just sort of thinking about bottle tops, what challenges and what challenges they face and what changes. The first challenge is that because we're dealing with network effects, which are all about valuing interactions with other users, it means that your first job as a platform is to make sure you have people on your platform. And this is what David called the critical mass challenge, and we're going to be talking about that in a bit. The second challenge is something we call, when we're teaching platform strategy, coring. And coring is the idea that you have to set up rules and regulations on your platform to make sure that not only do you have participants there, but when they're there, they behave well. This means you have to act as a police, you have to act as a mini government of that platform. And I was just so happy to hear the commissioner in his speech really pick up on this fact, because for me, this is one of the most interesting parts of a platform. If you look at the academic literature, it's really changed from being all about just network effects to being thinking about how we can best set up these rules and regulations on platforms to make these interactions go well. And it was just really happy to hear sort of recognition that, yes, we would expect this to exist. And what we need to do really is, rather than sort of thinking of it as suspicious, is instead to work out, well, is this benefiting consumers in the way we would hope, given the idea of this kind of policy is to make sure people behave well. All right, so now we're going to turn to the second act, which is thinking about network effects as a potential barrier to entry. And here I must admit I cheated a bit in that, as I say, I teach this platforms class, and what we do there is I help firms who are starting up platforms work out how to break into platform markets. And so I was thinking, well, those strategies are going to be very useful for thinking about whether or not you're going to be able to break into a platform market or not. Now, to do this, I always use this equation to try and remind my students to think about, well, what is the right way of analyzing how customers behave when they're thinking about whether to adopt a certain platform or another. And all this says is the network benefits, those are the benefits I get from network effects, plus the standalone benefits must be greater than the net price I'm paying. Now, this is going to be a useful tool. I think it helps us not only analyze barriers to entry, but you can immediately see the chicken and egg problem that David described in this equation. In that, if I'm a newcomer, I'm an entrant, and I want to break in this market, grab customers, and I'm competing with an existing platform, then I have a problem. In that I don't have any network benefits, they, by just sheer virtue of their size, have these network benefits. So how am I ever going to break into this kind of market as a tiny firm? Now, the good news is it's actually less chicken and eggy most of the time than you might think, and there's some, reasonable ways, or there are reasonable reasons to believe that actually it's not the big barrier to entry you might think. And what I always do to decompose this is to say, well, really, how strong are those network effects that you're worrying about curtailing your ability to enter? And I identify, this comes from my research, 3 different drivers of the strength of network effects. Now, the first driver is that in early theory models, and also in early empirical applications, there was always an inbuilt assumption that network effects were just a function of n. That is the total number of people using the platform. And if you believe that, then my gosh, that means that network effects can be quite a sizable potential barrier to entry. However, in reality, what I found, and this sort of comes from my dissertation, which is a very long time ago, where I looked to see really, is that how network effects behave? And there I was studying people using a video messaging system. And what was really noticeable was just the fact that when people were thinking about whether or not to adopt this particular platform, they didn't care about the complete size of the network of people using it. Instead, they were just focused on the few individuals that they knew they would be communicating with. And that suggests that network effects can be very localized and therefore potentially a little bit more fragile than we sometimes believe. We can see that playing out in platforms too. If I want to use this kind of website which brings together schools and parents, well then, you know what? I'm not going to give up my job at MIT. I'm not moving. I'm only going to be caring about schools in the local area. Whatever happens in Washington State, I'm pleased for them, but it's not going to affect my decision about what website to use. So I think then the question comes, well, given this, when might we actually think that network effects could be a function of the entire size of the platform rather than these small little clusters of behavior? And I always think a sort of good edge case for this is thinking about a genetic database style of platform. Well, there potentially, because you're searching for the proverbial needle in the haystack, as a researcher, perhaps trying to develop new pharmaceuticals, then I'm going to want to just have access to as many patient histories as possible. And if I'm a patient knowing that with a rare disease, knowing that I am facing a needle in the haystack type search processor, I'm going to be looking for the database where there are going to be the most researchers, because it's not clear where any kind of genetic cure may come from. So there we can make an argument that network effects may be a function of sheer size. But I want you to notice that in some sense, the reason that size is so important there is because people are not clear or not certain about who they want to interact with. And I think one of the most fundamental drivers of how large the scope of network effects is just certainty over interactions and whether or not users want the option value potentially of being able to communicate or interact with everyone else, people they don't know they want to interact with yet. And we can see this a little bit with social networks, and in particular the demise of certain social networks. One of the most stunning ones I've ever seen is this social network called Friends United. It was like many social networks, this was based in the UK, but in 2005 it was bought for vast amounts of money by a major UK TV company. It was described as the crown jewels of that TV company. Everyone was very excited about it. Within 6 months, it was completely dead, despite everyone in the UK basically using it. And if you go through its carcass, which is still there on the internet, what you ended up seeing is that just people posted on it, we've gone to Facebook. Because everyone knew each other, they were like, oh, my friends on Facebook. They went. It was that swift, that easy to coordinate off it. So I think the problem with these localized networks for thinking about them as when we have, the reason they don't tend to act so much as a barrier to entry is as soon as you've got a localized network, then it becomes more easy to coordinate and switch between different platforms. So this is going to bring us to the second thing, which is going to be important for the strength of network effects, which is multi-homing. Now, David's already sort of brought this up and said that we're going to discuss it later, so maybe I'm going to do something similar. But I do want to just make this point that much like with earlier, I think, antitrust issues, so much when you're analyzing the strength of network effects as a potential barrier to entry comes from this simple question of, is it the case that our users multi-home? And so, this is one of my favorite examples. I always find it amazing every time you get an Uber or Lyft. You just see the drivers be completely clear. We are multi-homing. We've got no loyalty to any one platform. And when you see that kind of pattern, as someone who loves competition, your heart should just sing. And I do also want to, the other sort of point is, why is this possible? Why do we see so much more multi-homing now in this age than we did, say, in the 1990s era of Microsoft? And I think a lot of it comes from the shift of computing away from being embedded on certain devices towards the cloud, which just makes porting your data, porting your identity across different platforms just so much more easy than it used to be. Last thing just to say in terms of the size of network effects is that we always sort of say it's going to worry that network effects may increase just in size, which could cause competitive concerns. I just want to point out there can be negative network effects too. I'll just tell you that as part of, I'm one of the co-founders of the Crypto Economics Lab at MIT. And one of our biggest successes at it, well, I say success, this is inverted commas, with that lab was we managed to make Bitcoin uncool at MIT. How did we do that? Well, we decided to give $100 in Bitcoin to everyone. And why did that make Bitcoin uncool? Well, all my cool techie people, techie undergraduates, suddenly saw that all the humanities undergraduates now had Bitcoin. That didn't make it cool anymore. That made it too mainstream, just too not at the edge. And as a result, they ended up selling those $100 in Bitcoin. You know what? That was in 2014. Do a quick bit of math to work out how much money they lost because we made Bitcoin uncool. Anyway, key point is that we always think you want to have everyone on the platform. Sometimes you really don't. These social and behavioral interactions are incredibly important. Now, we don't have much time for this, but just to say, of course, there are other ways of getting in. You can do something as simple as Instagram did, which is to tweak with standalone benefits. Think about Instagram when they entered that photo sharing market. They were facing these huge platforms such as Flickr at the time. How do they get in? Simply by understanding that 17-year-olds like the idea of Polaroid pictures, right? So we can also use standalone benefits as ways of getting around network effects too. All right. So let me come to the punchline as they're waving red signs at me and say this. First of all, I was told to give a talk about network effects, but I am so glad that the commissioner made the important point that really when you look at platform market, it's not just about network effects. It's also about coring and understanding these rules and regulations to make interactions go well and making sure that they are indeed there to make sure that interactions go well. We often think of network effects potentially as a source of barrier to entry because we're worried that big size reinforces size. But, I've given you 3 reasons to be slightly worried about that contention, in that generally network effects tend to be a lot smaller in scope than we might think. They tend to be very local. They tend to be undermined by multi-homing, and they tend to be undermined by behavioral impulses. The last thing, just to say on an even more optimistic note, is that we should be glad that in 2018, digitization has facilitated multi-homing, intensifying competition. And I still think that whenever we're thinking about these platforms and barriers to entry, the right question is really still ones of multi-homing versus single homing and switching costs. So I'll just say thank you.
Thank you, Catherine and David. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back at 10:20 for the next panel. Thanks.
We did our job.